Hi, my name is Nicco Valenzuela and welcome to my YouTube channel. If you were able to catch one of our episodes in the past few weeks, then hopefully you would have picked up a thing or two about using filters for landscape photography. This is part 2 of our landscape photography filters crash course, and this time we will talk about using filters in combination. One of the most common questions I get about filters is the simple question of, what filter do I get? Or, which filters do I get? And that's actually very hard to answer overall because, well, there's no single combination of filters that works in every single situation. So in this video, we'll talk about my suggestions for different combinations in different shooting scenarios. Let's talk about first my general recommendations on how we actually attach the filters on the filter holder. Now, if you're new to this is a filter holder and this is our adapter ring. The adapter ring goes onto the front of your lens, and for this brand, Nicco filters, the CPL also goes into the adapter ring. So there's a slot here for the adapter ring to attach, and we lock it like this. Now, so obviously, the CPL goes in the first slot that's nearest to the lens in general. And the next, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 slots on the filter holder. Now, this is something important. I want to teach you how to put them in order to be able to come up with generally better quality images. Okay. For the first slot, this is where we put our darkest or densest ND filter. Simply because being able to put that nearest the lens helps your lens focus, especially when your ND filter is very dark. And generally, the tip is to put the darkest ND filter on the first slot. If you're using another ND filter that's lighter, it goes on the next slot. And the following slot is your GND if you're going to use one. Generally, I would recommend limiting your number of filters to about 3 filters because we don't want way too much number of layers of glass in front of your lens between your subject and your sensor. Simply because of the principle that anything you put in front of the lens minimally declines your image quality just a bit, and you don't want to push that too far. So there. Use up to 3 filters, and you can put 1 or 2 NDs or 1 or 2 GNDs. So to help you better visualize these, we came up with this diagram. Now this is your lens, and right next to it is the filter holder. You will see 3 slots on the filter holder plus a slot for the CPL in between. On the lower right portion, you will see the legend for the filters. The blue one stands for CPL, the black one stands for an ND filter, and the red one stands for a GND. Now you will also see a red symbol with some black parts in the bottom. That basically represents an upside down GND filter for a certain use that we will talk about later. Our first scenario is the most basic that any aspiring landscape photographer should know how to shoot, and these are cloudy sunsets. The goal for this scenario is basically to lengthen your exposure for allowing the movement of the clouds to scud, also to balance out the exposure between your sky and the ground, and also if you're shooting in the proper kind of situation to make the blue skies bluer. For this, we will need, of course, a CPL. Next, we will need a 10-stop or 6-stop ND filter depending on how fast the clouds are moving. And lastly, we need a soft GND that we will use to balance out the foreground and the sky. This will also give you more details in the very nice texture of the sky. For this particular shot, which was taken in Santa Ignacia, Tarlac, I used a 10-stop ND to slow down the movement of the clouds, which were moving pretty fast. And I used a CPL just to enhance the contrast a bit. And of course, I used a medium GND just to balance out the exposure of the clouds and of the field. I wanted more emphasis on the lone tree, which was basically my main subject of interest. Our next scenario is wave painting seascapes. The goal here is to basically slow down your exposure to about half a second to maybe 3 or 4 seconds to give your foreground a very nice texture using the crashing of the waves. To do that, we use a 3-stop ND filter to slow down our exposure, and we use a 3-stop GND filter to balance out the sky and the foreground. Our choice of GND filters basically depends on this question: is there anything protruding over your horizon? If there's anything that goes from your foreground to your horizon, then basically you need a soft edge or a medium GND. If not, then you can use a hard edge or even a reverse GND filter. This shot, which was taken in Santa Monica Pier in California, I basically did a 3-second exposure to get the nice texture of the waves. And this shot, which was taken in San Fernando, La Union, basically I did it a bit longer at about 4 seconds just to get that very rugged look. Our next scenario is windy landscapes. Here our goal is to max out our exposure to help the clouds be able to render a very nice texture in the sky. To do this, we use a CPL to bring out more contrast in the sky. Next, we use a 10-stop ND filter or maybe even something darker just to let the time pass and let more clouds scud in your frame. And lastly, we use a 3 or 4-stop GND or maybe a combination of GNDs just to balance out the sky and the foreground. You want to use more GNDs if in case you're shooting much earlier than the sunset. On this photo of the Mayon volcano, I slowed down the exposure to about 45 seconds for 2 things. First is I want the clouds to move a certain way, and second is I want the water to smoothen. Our next shooting scenario is actually shot in a very similar way. Shooting long exposures at noon requires a much darker ND filter, for example a 15-stop ND filter, and also the use of a GND or a combination of GNDs plus a CPL. On this diagram, we have a CPL filter. This is actually the time where we can do most intensification of the blues of the sky. Next, we use a very dark ND filter, for example, a 15-stop, simply because this is the brightest part of the day. Next, we use either a 3 or 4-stop ND filter or a combination of 3-stop ND filters, simply because this is, again, the brightest part of the day. This black and white architectural photo was shot for 4 minutes with the use of that specific combination. Next, we have minimalist seascapes. The goal here is to do a long exposure to smoothen the water and at the same time blur out or totally erase anything in the sky. This achieves the minimalist effect. For this, we use a CPL that's turned the other way to actually lessen the reflections on the water. Next, we use a 15 or 12-stop ND filter to really do a very long exposure. And lastly, of course, we use a GND filter to balance out the sky and the water. For this shot, which was taken in Panabo, Davao, I used a 12-stop ND filter to do a 2-minute exposure to do exactly that. Our next scenario is shooting waterfalls and flowing water. The goal here is to do a long exposure to have a thick curtain of the water flow, and of course we want to eliminate the glare that's created by the splashes of water. To do this, we use a CPL to eliminate any glare and reflections from the splashes of water. Next, we use a 10-stop or a 6-stop ND just to have a better flow of the water, and of course we use a GND to tame the skies. This photo of Talumpari Falls in Bulacan was shot with a 45-second exposure using a 6-stop ND filter. Our next scenario is nighttime cityscapes. Now you can actually shoot nighttime cityscapes without any filters, but sometimes your goal is actually to tame the city lights in the foreground, which is why we use this setup. For this one, we use an upside down GND filter with the darker part in the foreground to actually tame the city lights. Now you can do with that, but if you want to shoot longer exposures, you can also make use of a 3-stop ND filter just to extend your exposure from about 30 seconds to about 1 or 2 minutes. On this photo of the iconic Hawaiian town of Haleiwa, I shot this for 45 seconds with a 3-stop ND during twilight and of course an upside down GND filter. Now on this photo of the Makati city skyline in the Philippines, I simply used an upside down GND filter to bring more brightness in the moving clouds. So there we go. I hope you picked up a thing or two about shooting out in the field, but do remember that it takes time and experience for you to come up with your own combinations. For more videos, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, share this video so your friends can see, and of course, leave a like and a comment if you want to ask anything or suggest another topic.